There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending an hour watching someone else's life, then putting your phone down and feeling weirdly hollow. Like you were almost somewhere, and then you weren't. The strange part is, you knew it was happening as it happened. You weren't mindlessly scrolling. You were watching, paying attention, almost studying. And still, you closed the app feeling emptier than before you opened it. Most people explain this away as an addiction thing, a dopamine thing. A social media is designed to be a slot machine thing. And yeah, sure, the algorithm isn't exactly working in your favor. But here's the part that explanation always skips. Why that person? Why is it always a specific person, or a specific type of life, that pulls you in the hardest? If this were just about compulsive scrolling, you'd be equally transfixed by everything. But you're not. You're very specifically drawn to certain people's content, certain people's stories, and when you're in it, it doesn't feel passive. It feels almost urgent, like you're searching for something. That urgency is real, and it's not a flaw. It's actually your brain doing something pretty intelligent, just in a direction that isn't helping you. Here's what I mean. The brain runs on narrative. That's not a metaphor. It's literally how memory, motivation, and meaning-making are structured. Your brain is always trying to answer the question, where is this going? It needs a story, something with direction, tension, and a sense that things are moving forward. When that story is your own life, you feel engaged, present, grounded. But when your own life starts to feel static, when there's no clear direction, when the days feel interchangeable, when you can't really point to anything and say, this is building towards something, the brain doesn't just sit quietly with that. It gets uncomfortable. It starts looking for a narrative to fit into, and it doesn't particularly care if that narrative is yours. So you pick up your phone, and there's someone else's story, already written, already in motion, already going somewhere. And your brain doesn't care that it's not your life. It just settles into it. The tension of watching someone build something gives you a diluted version of the feeling of building something. Watching someone fall in love, change careers, move cities, figure it out. Your brain rides that story the same way it would ride your own, just at a lower resolution. This is what I'd call a narrative vacuum, and it's the thing almost nobody talks about when they explain why watching other people's lives feels so hard to stop. The problem isn't your phone. The problem is that your own life doesn't currently have enough story tension to compete. And I want to be careful here, because I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean it as a diagnosis. Once you understand what's actually happening, just put the phone down. Sounds like telling someone hungry to stop thinking about food. The pull isn't coming from the app. The app is just where the pull leads. The pull is coming from somewhere much closer to home. I spent a pretty long stretch of my mid-20s deeply invested in people I'd never met. Not in a weird way, just in the way where I always seemed to know what they were working on, what they were building, what decisions they were making, who they were becoming. And I told myself it was research, inspiration, learning, and some of it genuinely was. But some of it was something else, which I didn't want to look at directly, which was, I didn't know what I was building. I had a job, a routine, things were fine. But when I tried to imagine where my own life was going, it got blurry fast. And so instead of sitting with that blur, which felt uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite name, I watched other people who had sharper images of their futures and borrowed their clarity for a while. The thing that finally made it click for me was noticing which people I couldn't stop watching. Because it was never random, it was always someone doing a specific thing. And when I looked at that specific thing, it was always something I'd told myself wasn't realistic for me, wasn't serious enough to want, or wasn't the kind of thing someone like me did. The people whose lives felt most consuming to watch were like mirrors reflecting the version of me I hadn't given myself permission to become yet. This is something I now think is almost universally true. The people who consume your attention the most aren't just interesting. They're reflecting something at you, the specific flavor of envy, or whatever you want to call that feeling, because it's not always clean enough to call envy, points directly at something you want. Not vaguely want, specifically want, in a way you may haven't said out loud. And instead of feeling that want and doing something with it, watching someone else live it becomes a kind of pressure valve. You get close enough to the feeling to release some of the tension, but not close enough to do anything about it. Which is why you can watch the same kind of content for months and still feel that pull every time. It never actually resolves, because you're treating the symptom, not the source. And this is exactly where the standard advice collapses. Spend less time on your phone is trying to solve a navigation problem by confiscating the map. The pull toward other people's lives isn't the problem. The pull is information. The question is whether you're reading it or just feeling it. There's also a second layer to this that's worth understanding, which is what happens to your own sense of self the longer you stay in the spectator loop. Because here's something a little uncomfortable. Your brain can't fully distinguish between experiencing something and watching someone else experience it. There's a reason you feel nervous watching someone else almost fall, or feel satisfied watching someone cross a finish line. The mental simulation your brain runs when you observe someone doing something is a cousin of the simulation it runs when you're actually doing that thing. Not the same, definitely not the same, but close enough that it creates a kind of false familiarity with experiences you've never actually had. And the longer you watch someone build a business, or travel, or create things, the more your brain starts to register that territory as explored. Not consciously, but there's a subtle sense of, yeah, I know what that's like. That starts to form, even though you don't, even though you've only watched. And that's a problem, because it quietly reduces the urgency to actually go do the thing. The hunger gets just fed enough to stay manageable, but never fed enough to go away. So, you end up in this loop, where watching other people's lives feels consuming, and the way you handle feeling consumed is to watch more. The more you watch, the more your brain treats watching as a substitute for doing, and the further you get from the actual life you're sitting with that pull about. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like a spiral. It just feels like another hour passed, and nothing really changed, and there's this faint unease you can't quite locate. The way out of that loop isn't discipline. It's direction. Because what the loop is really asking for isn't restraint, it's something to move toward that's actually yours. And this is the part where I want to get practical, because I think a lot of content on this topic ends at the diagnosis and leaves you with the problem just better labeled, which isn't particularly useful. So here's the shift that actually helped me, and that I've watched help other people when they actually try it. The next time you notice you're deeply in it, watching someone's life in that specific consuming way, instead of trying to stop, get curious about it first. Not in a therapeutic, journaling way, just a simple, honest question. What is it about this specific life that I can't look away from? Not, why am I doing this in a self-critical way? More like, if I had to steal one thing from this person's life and make it mine, what would it be? And then, importantly, what is the smallest, most embarrassingly simple version of that thing I could do in my own life this week? Not a plan, not a pivot. Just a small, honest acknowledgement that the pull is pointing somewhere real, and a tiny step in that direction. What the brain actually needs, what stops the loop, isn't less input. It's more of a signal from your own life that something is moving. Even a small thing moving creates enough narrative tension to re-engage with your own story. And once your own story starts to feel like it's going somewhere, the gravitational pull of other people's lives starts to loosen. Not because their lives become less interesting, but because yours starts to feel like it's actually happening. I noticed this almost immediately when I started treating the consuming feeling as a compass rather than a failure. The people I watched most intently gave me a very clear read on what I was avoiding and what I wanted. And when I stopped avoiding it and started moving toward it, even slowly, even imperfectly, the urgency to be inside someone else's story grew quieter. Because my own story finally had somewhere to go. What's worth sitting with is that the consuming feeling was never the problem. The consuming feeling was the most honest thing you had. It was your own mind trying to show you something about what you care about, in the only language it had available, attention. You care about things intensely. That's not something to fix. The question is just whether that intensity is pointed at someone else's life or yours.